So now we get to go back to the oscillator section and look at additional sound shaping and sound generation possibilities. We'll start by looking at harmonia, one of the mult options, and see how it works using sampled sound sources. I'll search and press enter for the power strings sound source. Let's see how it sounds without any further modification by harmonia. There's a bit of a sharp attack. Let me see if I can fix that. I've adjusted sample start later to try and bypass the beginning of the sample. And we'll assign a slower attack time for the amplitude envelope. Let's go to the mult option. The small blue light below serves as an on-off switch. The button above opens the various mult settings. There's also a power switch available once you're looking at the settings themselves. From the center pop-up, we can choose from one of three options for the mult function: unison, harmonia, or granular. Harmonia allows you to layer up to 4 additional voices. These voices are identical to the primary sound source, though they can be transposed up or down. Here, the first additional voice is tuned 7 semitones, or a fifth above. The second voice is at unison, with a slight detuning. Now here's just the unison voice with variable amounts of detuning. First, we'll listen with no detuning. Next, I'll increase the amount of detuning significantly. There's the rapid beating of the chorusing or heterodyning effect. Tuning them closer together results in slower beating. So let's turn that first voice at the fifth back on. You can use the steppers or this pop-up to set the pitch relationship of the duplicate voice to the primary sound source. Next, we adjust the level and pan of these duplicate voices, and then add additional voices. Adding a voice 2 octaves below the primary sound source really beefs up this sound. Now I'll add a little sheen to the top end by setting a voice to 2 octaves or 24 semitones above. Now I'll add some additional emotion to the voice by increasing the detuning of the octave voice. This makes the beating of the chorusing effect more intense. And I'll finish up by increasing the level of the low end and high sheen tones. As we'll see in the next video, harmonia has some additional tricks up its sleeve. In this video, we'll see that the harmonia function has some additional capabilities when working with synthesized waveforms. I'll select a bright saw square as our sound source. Next, I'll choose the mult settings, activate the power switch, and select harmonia from the center pop-up as our process. As we saw in the earlier video, there are 4 additional voices. We can adjust level, pan, and fine-tuning with detune knobs, and coarse transposition with steppers or this pop-up. These double arrows in the middle switch us to a second page available only for synthesized sound sources. On this page, we can adjust offset values from shape, symmetry, and hard sync settings of the primary oscillator, as well as choose the oscillator wave shape itself. We can choose either an alternate wave shape or using OSC, the primary wave shape. Here's the primary voice with the unison copy. The secondary voice is detuned, leading to a beating chorusing effect. Turning off the detuning, let's check out this phase button. Just like the analog knob, this causes a shift in phase of the doubled voice relative to the primary sound. I've turned off harmonia phase shift, but I'm still hearing the effect. It turns out that the analog knob can also cause harmonia voices to phase shift. If I turn them both off, there is no phase shift. There are 4 levels of phase shift available within harmonia. These range from slightly out of phase to completely out of phase. And as we saw, this can interact with the analog knob. So we can go back to our Harmonia page and set up a typical stacked synth sound. Here we've got our octave and our fifth with a little detuning. Now let's add an octave and a fourth above, 17 semitones. An octave below. Sounds okay, but let me turn that to an octave and a fifth, 19 semitones. Boost the level of my octave subbass and increase internal motion by further detuning the unison. Once we set up our stack parameters, we can go to page 2 to get some additional color out of our tones. For subtle differences, try offsetting the shape and symmetry sliders of some of the oscillators. For more drastic results, choose a different wave shape. Here I'm using a sine wave in the subbass for a mellow bottom. Or we can get a heavier, more biting subbass with a different oscillator choice. Another color is hard sync offset. Static adjustments of individual sync offsets certainly change the sound pretty drastically. Now let's make things a little more interesting by assigning all 4 sync knobs to be controlled by the mod wheel. Right-click on one of the knobs, choose MIDI-CC Learn, and move the mod wheel. Repeat this for a second knob. For the third and fourth knobs, right-click and select MIDI-CC Learn Inverted. These 2 voices will now respond in the opposite direction to the mod wheel. Controlling these multiple sync sliders gives me a pretty wide tonal palette to play with. As you can see, Harmonia allows you to generate some pretty deep sounds out of a single oscillator in just one layer. Another one of our multiplier processes is the unison function. Let's start with a simple triangle waveform. We'll select unison from the pop-up and turn on the power. In the main section, notice the position of analog and phase, currently all the way to the left. The unison process generates 1 to 8 additional voices that are played along with your original primary sound source. Detune controls the amount of pitch shifting of these voices, while depth controls the number of unison voices and spread the stereo panning. Unison voices can be shifted by 1 or 2 octaves up or down. The unison process never alters the original sound source voice. Even with the controls at their minimal settings, it's obvious that a second voice is generated and slightly detuned, creating a minimal chorusing effect. As with Harmonia, unison phase spreads the start phase of the unison copies. But in the case of the triangle wave, I hear no change. Even with analog on, this doesn't work. It turns out that for triangle waveforms only, the start phase has to be not all the way to the left. Once we adjust this, we can hear that every note has a different character. So we can turn off analog and just bring up the unison phase control. Now let's check out detune. Increasing the amount of fine detuning of the second unison voice changes the character of the chorusing effect. The rate of beating increases. So we're going to use the fine detuning option for chorusing or thickening effects. With coarse detuning, we can shift up to an octave. We also have octave transposition buttons to move the unison voices. The original voice is always left untouched. Depth controls how many unison voices are generated. Increase this amount for thicker and fatter sounds, but be aware it places a greater load on your CPU. The spread parameter places the unison voices further and further out in the stereo field. Omnisphere's unison function is polyphonic. The different unison voices are generated for every single note you play within a chord. You can use unison to multiply sampled voices as well as synth voices. The only thing missing is the phase control. Unison is a great way to make any simple oscillator instantly thicker and richer. Turn this into this, or this, or this, or how about this? Our final multiplier process, granular synthesis, is available for sampled sound sources only. We'll turn on our power switch and choose granular from the central pop-up area. Here's the sample with no processing, just the raw waveform. Already an interesting sound. The granular process takes the audio file and slices it into potentially very short segments. They can then be repitched, detuned, and then played back randomly. Grain depth determines the number of grains or slices taken. The effect here is still subtle. The intensity slider will determine the length of each of the grains. At short lengths, the repetition seems much faster. At high settings, you can clearly hear the fast staccato repetition of the short bits of audio. The smoothing function applies a short crossfade envelope at the beginning and end of every single grain, smoothing out the transition to the grains before and after. This is especially useful when working with short grains or high intensities. The individual grains can be randomly detuned from the original sound source, which has never changed. The slider determines the range of detuning. So fast intensities can be used to create granular cloud effects. Many of the sounds in Omnisphere's library utilize a slower and more subtle version of this effect. So I'll bring down detune and intensity. The controls in this last section allow us to set up a random grain detuning of anywhere of a semitone to an octave. With the pitch grains slider all the way down, the other sliders, interval and gliding, have no effect. The pitch grain slider determines how many of the grains will be shifted by an amount determined with the interval slider from a semitone to an octave. I'll choose 12 semitones and click the up arrow. With the up arrow selected, the random pitch detuning is always in an upward direction. The gliding parameter can help us achieve a spooky, slithery sound. Some of the grains will glide rather than jump between the two pitches. This slider determines how often that occurs. Choosing the down arrow forces the random transposition of grains to go down one octave from the primary sound source. That's kind of a nice, spooky effect. The third arrow randomly chooses a direction. Once a note is sustaining, it continues to transpose in only that direction. That was down. And this one's up. With the fourth arrow, a single sustaining note will randomly alternate between either up or down transpositions. To complete your self-hypnosis session, adjust the spread parameter. This randomly pushes the grains further and further out in the stereo field. So we've taken a simple sound source with no processing whatsoever and given it a nice spooky texturized feel. This one definitely deserves a slow fade.